So, if we may, we'll jump straight into questions. Duncan, do you want to start us off?
Okay, thank you. If I may start by asking about timetables. We're familiar with what happened in 2015, which saw a Prime Minister appointed on the 11th of May.
2010.
Sorry, 2010, yes. A Prime Minister appointed on the 11th of May and a Queen's speech delivered by the 25th of May. What factors do you see which could affect the length of the negotiating period were we not to have a clear majority for one party after the 2015 election?
Can I briefly go first?
Yeah.
I think there are three reasons why it's very likely to take longer than 5 days before the negotiations are concluded. Number one, there are likely to be more players in the game this time round. Last time there were only the three major parties in contention: Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. This time it's quite possible that the SNP will be a player in the game. It's quite possible, depending on the numbers, that other nationalist or minor parties might also be players in the game. So, more players is the first reason. Second reason is I think it's very likely that the parliamentary parties will take a closer interest and will expect to be consulted more closely before they allow their party leaders to sign up to any deal. And we've already had strong indications, for example, from Graham Brady, speaking for the 1922 committee, that the 22 would expect to be more fully consulted in 2015 than they were in 2010. We know in 2010 that the Lib Dems parliamentary group met 3 times, and on the third occasion they were shown the text of the draft coalition agreement. Whereas I think it's correct that the 22 committee were given the headlines by their party leader, but were not shown the text. And I think it's very likely next time that all parliamentary parties will insist on closer consultation. Third reason is we forget that in 2010 the agreement reached after 5 days was not formally the coalition agreement, which became the programme for government. The programme for government is the formal coalition agreement, and Kath can help me on the dates. I think it was the 19th of May?
It's 13 days after the
election. Yes, 13 days after the election. So if you accept my second reason, that the parties will insist on closer consultation because they'll be concerned about the detail, I think it's unlikely that any deal can be signed until all the detail has been negotiated, and it's likely, therefore, that any agreement next time will be more like the programme for government that was reached after almost 2 weeks than the initial coalition agreement that was reached after only 5 days.
Thank you. There were riots in certain European capitals at the time in 2010. There was a lot of interest in how the markets would respond when they opened on, I think, Monday the 10th of May. Do you see particular risks associated with the longer timetable that you've outlined?
Sure. I mean, just to add a few points to what Robert's just said, I agree with all of that. And also, I think what he's getting at partly is it would be better for the negotiations, in a sense, if one goes to a full coalition negotiation, if there is a bit of more of an expectation that they can take a bit longer and that one can go through that process. We also have a belief that expectations may have changed. That partly goes to your point there, that perhaps certainly media and political expectations and the public's expectations may now have changed to allow for a bit of a longer period than the pressure we saw last time round. But there are, I mean, as well as that, we should also remember that this will all come down to the results. We know from last time round that the exit poll was not what we were expecting entirely from the polls in the run-up to it, and the coalition in agreement wasn't as well. So momentum and the actual arithmetic may affect whether or not we go into these full negotiations, or whether or not the parties have thought more in advance and actually they may find reason for having not necessarily a speedier process, but perhaps with a bit more experience than they had last time round. However, going to your question more particularly, I think we shouldn't be too concerned about the fact that if it takes a bit of a longer period, we do have a government in place, we do have an experienced political class in this area now, and we do have more understanding of what are the rules and conventions around how the incumbent government should act, what kind of issues might come up, and what might be the best way to act on it. We also, with the Fixed Term Parliament Act, have seen an opportunity for the government and the civil service to be able to prepare in advance, thinking about what kind of issues might come up, what policy areas and so forth. So I don't think we're immediately in any period of great concern. If it goes on a bit longer than last time round, I think your question is getting to the point of how long is too long a period of time, and it's very difficult for us to sort of speculate on that. We're not, I don't think, looking at Belgium or other places that have taken many months. I think the question is whether or not we go into a second week, whether or not it takes a bit longer, and what we need to think about in terms of the parliamentary calendar, rather than perhaps those sorts of issues.
So just on that very point, in 2010, after the election, the House first met on Tuesday the 18th of May, which I think was before the date you just gave for the publication of the actual coalition agreement. Given what you've been describing, do you think there would be a case for deferring the date at which the House first meets after the 2015 election in these circumstances?
The date will be set by a proclamation when the House is dissolved. We don't yet know. My guess is the proclamation will probably set the date for the first meeting of Parliament 12 days after the election, as happened in 2010. But it's possible, by a subsequent proclamation, to defer that date. So if the parties are involved very closely in negotiations and they signal that they don't think it will be sensible for Parliament to meet so quickly, a further proclamation can be made. But equally, there is stuff that can be done in the first days of a new Parliament, swearing in of new members, the election of a new Speaker, etc. So things, to some extent, can happen in parallel as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember last time round there was a delay to the Queen's speech of an additional few days because of the swearing in of new members or the number of new members last time round. And again, I mean, the date of the Queen's speech will be set on dissolution, but can also be moved, in this case, though, slightly more easily than the actual return of Parliament. And that will be the point at which, obviously, one would expect, you know, certainly if it's going to full coalition, then those sorts of negotiations to have continued. If it's not that kind of agreement, though, we have to remember that if it's a minority government or if there's some other kind of agreement, those sorts of negotiations do carry on well into a new Parliament and indeed throughout a new Parliament. So we may see a sort of period of formal negotiation, depending on what the parties want to do and what the result is. But you will then see other kinds of negotiations, including, should these circumstances arise, to get through the Queen's speech itself.
Just ask, why is there an assumption that members of Parliament themselves are incapable of participating effectively in this process the day after a general election? They've just been elected, the Parliament's been refreshed. Why is this a sense that the chaps have got to sort this out for us and present us with a deal, however long it takes? Can't we have parties meeting, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and many others, throughout 2 weeks, if necessary, having an interaction with their leaders, rather than the leaders really carving this up?
Yeah.
Chairman, that's up to the political parties.
Yeah.
If you want to convene a meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party the day after the election...
I wish.
But it also goes to what Robert's just said about the fact that you can have these going on in parallel. Obviously, the Queen's speech is the point at which a new government will or will not be confirmed. So it, in effect, bookmarks the end of that kind of period of formal negotiations. But those other processes, there is no reason in terms of the mechanics of the negotiations why they couldn't be going on in parallel.
Seems that government or leaders are quite frightened about political parties actually doing what political parties should do and having a discussion and doing it sensibly and maturely. We're going to go wild with this responsibility of deciding who the government should be.
Well, Chairman, as you will know, the different political parties have their own traditions, and in 2010, the Liberal Democrats were required by their constitution and by the famous triple lock to consult very extensively with the party. But it's a matter for the parties.
Thank you, Chair. I could share lots of what happened to us, but maybe now's not the place. If I might turn to the business of government and the operation of what is sometimes termed a caretaker government. Professor Hazell, I think you expressed some frustration that the Cabinet Office seems to avoid that term. Can you tell us what advantages you would see in terms of clarifying the conventions in these circumstances of wider use of that term by the civil service?
Yes, I think there are three terms I would like to see enter into common use. The Caretaker Convention, a Caretaker Government, and the Caretaker Period. And it would be much clearer, I think, both for people within government, in Whitehall, in Parliament, and outside, if that terminology could enter into common use. And I hope the committee in its report might feel able to recommend that. The one reason why I think the terminology at the moment is confused and confusing is because in the Cabinet Manual this is overlaid, mixed in with the guidance about the restrictions on government publicity, which are referred to as the PERDA rules. And those rules apply even when a government is not a caretaker government, but it has a full working majority, commands the confidence of Parliament. For example, we've had it in the course of this Parliament during the European elections, or indeed during local government elections. And the PERDA rules say to the incumbent government, when there's an election on, even if it's not a general election, you shouldn't use the government publicity machine to generate good news stories for your party. That's the rationale for PERDA. The rationale for the Caretaker Convention is completely different. A caretaker government is one which is in office. It is the government. It has the lawful authority to govern, but it no longer has full political authority because it no longer commands the confidence of Parliament. And that can happen in one of three circumstances. Firstly, after a general election has been called, so after the dissolution at the end of March, the present government will continue in office, but as a caretaker government. If there are negotiations after the election of the kind that we've just been discussing, the present government will continue further in office, but as a caretaker government. And if at some point in the future the government is the subject of a successful no-confidence motion, it then becomes a caretaker government because it's lost the confidence of Parliament, and as you will know, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act then provides a 14-day period in which Parliament can see whether a new government can be formed which can command confidence. So those are the three contexts in which there is a caretaker period and there is a caretaker government. And they have nothing to do with PERDA or the restrictions on government publicity.
I'd slightly differ from Robert. He's absolutely right, the differentiation between the two, particularly for the reasons that they exist. On the one hand, to restrict government activity in the civil service in terms of how the machine may be used in terms of campaigning. In the second case, because that government may or may not have legitimacy at that time. It's worth noting, though, in So therefore I do agree that in the UK case there's a reason for thinking of the two periods in different ways. It is worth noting though in Australia they refer to, I think, both as the caretaker period, and from what I've read of it and what I understand of it, it's partly because they see it as a restriction that's in place because Parliament isn't sitting and therefore can't provide the kind of scrutiny of what government is doing during both of those periods. So they have a slightly different approaches to it. However, I mean, going back to this point about caretaker governments and whether or not to call it that, I think, I mean, Robert's right in terms of the difficulties we have in this country, or that certainly have existed in terms of using that phrase. I think part of the reason is also because the tradition, certainly in the post-election period, wherever we've seen it, or in the case of a government that's lost vote of confidence, is that these are, by and large, by convention. It's down to ministers of the day to accept that convention and to adhere to it. On the part of the civil service, the rules are more clear-cut, and therefore there's clearer guidance to them about how they should act if they feel that the government is acting in contravention of these. But that doesn't entirely exist in the case of ministers. Ultimately, it's down to the Prime Minister as to how and in what ways he feels that his government should adhere to these. And after the last election, we did see a slight firming up of them in the Cabinet Manual, and therefore one assumed in terms of people's interpretation of it. I think Alistair Darling in his memoirs referred to it as not effectively an official convention, but rather something that he chose to do when he consulted with his opposite numbers over going to the ECOFIN meeting on that May weekend. In the Cabinet Manual now, it's emphasised more strongly that incumbent government should actually consult with their opposite numbers in these kind of cases, and so there's a slight firming up around those rules that I think is worth noting.
Thank you.
Can I add one thing? Sorry. The essence of the caretaker convention is that a caretaker government should try to do nothing which will tie the hands of a future government, because it may not be the future government. So, ideally, it should not make any major public appointments, it should not let any important government contracts, it should not embark on any new policy. That's the essence of the caretaker convention. And if it has to make a decision, as Alistair Darling thought he might have to when he went to the ECOFIN meeting on the 10th of May, then the default position, as Catherine has described, is to consult the opposition parties and to try to clear your lines with them.
Thank you. Finally, from me, if we could look at the question of the leadership of the caretaker government, I think there would be quite widespread dismay amongst parliamentarians at the thought of a technocratic leader of the government, as we've sometimes seen in some European countries. In other countries, there is an obligation on the outgoing Prime Minister to stay in office for the duration of the caretaker government until their successor can be appointed. Do you think that this is essentially incumbent on the British Prime Minister?
Yes, I feel very strongly that there is a duty on the incumbent Prime Minister to remain in office until it is clear who can command confidence in his place. So the Prime Minister should not go to see the Queen and say, "Ma'am, I wish to resign," unless he can confidently advise her whom to appoint, who can command confidence. Let's suppose this is after an election in the new Parliament. And I think the committee has received evidence from Dr. Petra Schleiter of Oxford saying in terms that in many continental European countries it's accepted that a caretaker government cannot resign. She's in effect saying the same thing in equally strong words, that a caretaker Prime Minister cannot or should not resign unless and until he can advise the monarch whom to appoint in his place.
I think there's two separate issues there. Excuse me. One is this issue about who stays in that role of leadership and this idea of technocratic government. And that goes back to the previous issue about why ultimately the caretaker government and the adherence to the caretaker rules lies with the Prime Minister and the rights of ministers to act. Because of that reason, ultimately, we need a Prime Minister, and that Prime Minister comes from that tradition. On the other issue, I think it's important to understand, though, that we also, whilst Robert's absolutely right in how he's articulated why we need to have a Prime Minister remain in place during this period, the difficulty we still have in this country is knowing at what point it is clear who can command confidence, when in some cases it's about speculation about who is likely to, if there's been no firm coalition agreements, and it's all about an expectation about what might happen when Parliament meets for the first time and has a Queen's Speech debate. And in some of those other countries that do have clearer convention in terms of the caretaker government staying in place until that process has been complete, they also have a clearer process for when that moment has passed. We still don't have, either in the Cabinet Manual or in our own popular understanding of it, that clear moment when we think, actually, yes, this is clear, except for the Queen's Speech, and that can often be well after a government has officially been formed.
Andrew?
So, the Prime Minister, assuming it, the current Prime Minister, remains in post until somebody else turns up. The Liberal Democrats may, like the Labour Party, be not in that group. In other words, they may not support that part. So he could lead us to the Queen's Speech, although he recognises that he doesn't fill a majority.
Yeah, this is we've been referring a lot in the last few weeks, since January really, to the 1923-1924 6-week period where Stanley Baldwin decided to attempt a Queen's Speech, and it took 6 weeks partly because of the Christmas period, before he was then defeated. It's in fact the last time a government was defeated at the then King's Speech. Ultimately, though, in terms of 2010, it's not that an incumbent government has the first right to negotiate with the parties. However, because of their incumbent status, they will have the first opportunity, if they wanted to stay in government and to go to a Queen's Speech and to try and command the support of the Commons in that way. So it does give them that first opportunity to test the Commons through whichever kind of negotiations they wish to do to gain that support to be able to pass through a Queen's Speech.
And who decides when Parliament will be recalled? They've announced they want it to be recalled on such and such a date, but then Parliament is dissolved. At what point does that reassembly actually take place?
Well, at the time of dissolution, a proclamation will be issued,
yes,
giving the date of meeting of the new Parliament.
Yeah.
And the date of the new Queen's Speech.
Yes, yes.
So unless the government then, when it returned, then was able to change the Queen's Speech date.
And what would solve that? Who decides when the Queen's Speech will be?
Ultimately, the government.
Yes, it's the Prime Minister.
So although he doesn't have a majority, he could put off for 6 months the Queen's Speech.
Well, let's get real politically.
Okay. Okay. 3 weeks.
And before I come to this, could I just go back? Because the chairman at the beginning said it's really important that the public have a better understanding of the rules and what will happen in practice.
Yeah.
And we've been discussing the duty of the incumbent Prime Minister to remain in office. And you will remember that in 2010, there were outrageous headlines in some newspapers over the weekend, squatter in number 10, trying to put pressure on the then Prime Minister to resign early. I think they were outrageous, and I think that Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister, was doing his public duty in remaining in office as the incumbent Prime Minister until the negotiations had been sufficiently concluded that he could advise the Queen whom to appoint in his place. And if, after the 2015 elections, there are any similar headlines suggesting that David Cameron is squatting in number 10, I shall be equally forceful in saying, no, he's not. He's doing his public duty as the incumbent Prime Minister to remain in office as a caretaker until he can advise the Queen whom should form the new government. And if, I'm now coming to what I think is your question, if the negotiations between the parties don't lead to a clear outcome, in the unlikely event that there isn't a winning combination that emerges from those negotiations, then the default position is that the incumbent Prime Minister has the right to meet the new Parliament and to present a Queen's speech as his programme for government to test whether that can command confidence. That was what happened, as Catherine's described, in 1924, and the Conservatives, in round numbers, in that 1924 Parliament, had 260 seats. The Liberals had 190, and Labour had 160. And when Baldwin was defeated on the Queen's speech, it was a Labour minority government that was formed with only 160 seats. So this is the other thing that people need to be aware of, and we need to prepare the public in terms of their expectation that it's not necessarily the largest single party that forms the new government.
Well, that satisfies me, because I would be in a difficulty if I felt that period was going on and on and on with no evidence of end. But I can see what you're proposing, and so it could be that the Labour Party couldn't agree with the SNP, for example. But one of those parties, probably the Labour Party, would be the larger of those two parties, and that would give the Prime Minister the opportunity to test himself against both other parties who could agree on that, even though they wouldn't want to create a coalition of the parties.
This is, again, another very important part of preparing public expectations, that in a hung parliament, a minority government is also perfectly possible and feasible. One might even have a minority coalition, which when we've been briefing the broadcasters, they regarded as something rather exotic and rare. But again, in other countries, in Denmark, in New Zealand, it's quite common to have a minority coalition.
Yes, in the case that you're talking about, as Robert's implied, the passing of a Queen's speech is not just about being able to get all of the support together to, display publicly how many parties are on your side. It's also about the opposition parties failing to get together a majority to defeat the government, whether a minority government or, in any other circumstances. So it's that kind of process of whipping, of gathering support, of negotiations behind the scenes and so forth in that case.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And Andrew, of course it's a fixed 5-year term, and therefore it may well be that the government you start with at the beginning of the 5 years isn't necessarily the government that you will have all the way through. There could be a coalescence of various parties to take government forward to the end of the term.
Indeed in 1977, where we had a vote of no confidence against the then Callaghan minority government, and he gathered together Liberal support and was able to put together what we call the Lib Lab Pact of support. Almost, I think it was quite was it confidence and supply, or was it not formally?
In effect, it was
in effect
supply.
Confidence supply.
Yeah.
and that, pass him through a period of time. So it's also entirely possible that you could start with a minority government that then decides to be a coalition government at a later stage in its life. There's all sorts of possibilities that may happen over the period.
Including a grand coalition of the two main parties, with the smaller parties out in the cold.
I see the Conservative members of your committee smiling, Chairman.
No idea why. Andrew, back to you.
Yes. I don't share the implication of this question, but I should ask, should there be a way for the House to demonstrate support for Prime Minister and administration as soon as possible after he is appointed?
Well, this goes to the dilemma that we've been discussing, that the negotiations may take some weeks, and it may not immediately be clear whether a new government can command confidence. And, as you know, the traditional way of testing that is to present a Queen's speech and then to have a debate that lasts for 5 or 6 days with a vote on the last day of the debate. And I think I gave the dates in my written submission. So in 2010, the formal vote at the end of the Queen's speech debate wasn't until the 8th of June. So about 5 weeks after the date of the election. And at this stage, we're exploring possibilities of ways in which, if it's felt important to try to establish whether the new government can command confidence in the new Parliament, to do so earlier. One possibility would be not to leave until 5 or 6 days after the Queen's speech, the formal vote, but to hold it, for example, immediately after the Queen's speech. And my understanding from initial discussions with the clerks is that that would be procedurally possible. Another more radical procedure would be to hold what in Scotland is called a nomination vote. So in the Scottish Parliament, after electing the presiding officer, their Speaker, the first piece of business is to nominate the First Minister. And they hold a series of votes in which typically the parties vote pretty much in their party blocks, supporting, as it were, their candidate. And the person who wins the series of votes is then nominated and appointed as First Minister by the Queen. And so that is a very clear early way of the Parliament deciding who shall form the government, deciding who shall be the head of the new government. And it's a way of cutting through the possible period of uncertainty if it's not clear that a government might be able to carry a Queen's speech or not. As I say, at the moment, these are simply possibilities that we're exploring. We're not yet strongly advocating these things.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
There are a couple of questions, and some of them will touch back on points already raised. Coming from an Irish background, I'm conscious that the Irish Constitution in the English language version provides that the Taoiseach, the government, will carry on, is the actual language used, which of course throws up the sense of a carry-on government. So I'm quite sure that you would not wish that language to be brought in here. But in the Irish situation, it is quite clear there's a very different date set, a very specific date set for the convening of the next Dáil, and it usually means that there is something like about a month between the general election and actually the approval of the government. And I know that's a long period where a government remains in office even though it may well have lost the confidence of the country. The sort of protocols and conventions that you say would need to attach to a caretaker period haven't always been observed in an Irish government situation, and various public appointments and all the rest of it have been made in that period, and there's been sort of, bad sort of last orders habits that have taken place. But do you think there could be a marriage between the sort of protocols and standards that you have said and the clear space that is left in the Irish system to leave very good room and comfortable time in which programmes for government can be negotiated without too much speculative stress on the parties involved?
There is an English translation of the Irish carry-on government, and it's an old maxim, and again it is the rationale of the Caretaker Convention. It is that the Queen's business must be carried on. The Queen must never be without responsible advisers. So that's what lies at the root of the Caretaker Convention. You mentioned possible abuses of it in Ireland, and the Cabinet Manual in this respect is quite strong in seeking to uphold the Caretaker Convention, in that it has a paragraph which encourages permanent secretaries who feel that a minister is at risk of breaching the Convention, for example, in making an important public appointment and thus tying the hands of a future government when there is an alternative course of action open, to seek a ministerial direction. Now, normally, a permanent secretary will do so as a counting officer because he's concerned that a minister wants to make a decision which involves the improper use of public money or possibly even the illegal use of public money. And he can then formally seek a direction, which is a permanent secretary's way of waving a red flag in front of the minister and saying, I formally advise you that what you're planning to do is wrong, and I am seeking a formal written instruction that you are instructing me to do this. And the Cabinet Manual goes on to make arrangements for publicising that ministerial direction so that it becomes public knowledge. But the last thing I want to say before handing on to Kath, and she's the expert about this, is that it's not necessarily a bad thing to have longer periods of transition. And Catherine, together with Peter Riddle, did a really important study about transitions and the transition period in other countries.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. That was exactly the point I was going to make. I mean, it's a separate issue as should we have a more delayed handover. We are remarkably unique in this, the idea of a day after change of government, the removal vans, all of that. And it's wonderful drama, it's produced wonderful drama, but if one's looking at it from the point of view of effective governments, effective politicians, it doesn't entirely make sense, and it's not what is the tradition in other countries, even those that have very comparable systems to our own. And it would be difficult to change, though, partly because we've become so used to it. The idea of another government staying on after, it has effectively lost office, if we're then talking about a more clear-cut change of government under a majority. But there are good reasons for it. But that's a separate issue from this other one, which is about the Caretaker Convention and what those rules should be around it, and also what the process of scrutiny and the effectively the restrictions, the way in which it can be, the governance of it, shall we say. It's worth noting that even in those countries that we usually refer to that have caretaker conventions, Australia, New Zealand in particular, the New Zealand Caretaker Convention is one model that was looked at in great detail here before we developed the Cabinet Manual. Even there, they explicitly say that you can have no hard and fast rules on every eventuality that it might cover. In Australia, there's a very good book that was out recently by Anne Tiernan on caretaker conventions in Australia, or in Australasia in particular, which talks about a range of controversies from the very minor to the much more significant that they've suffered and continue to, in terms of how the Caretaker Convention is interpreted, how political parties will either use it or at least, certainly make clear when they feel it has been abused or has been broken, shall we say. So it's always a difficult process, even in those circumstances. And the then Cabinet Secretary, Gus O'Donnell, talking before the last election when we were developing the draft Cabinet Manual guidance on all of this, talked about this issue and was pushed quite hard on the question of how can you, in certain circumstances, decide what is and is not a breach. And that's what he referred back to, is the fact that it's very difficult to have hard and fast rules on every eventuality. So in the end, it needs some kind of judgment. And as with all things political in this space, it will come down to the political judgment not only of the incumbent government, of the civil service, their own judgments about whether or not it has breached those rules that would require a ministerial directive, but also of the public, of politicians more widely, Parliament when it returns, and of the media. So there is a form of accountability with a lowercase a that will exist around it. The more familiar we are with it, the more experience that we have of it, if circumstances arise that it's needed to be used, then the more we'll be able to judge what circumstances can constitute a breach.
Mm-hmm. And the sort of consultation that might take place, say it was an ECOFIN meeting or something else, or something else sensitive there on the EU or broader international horizon. It may be that there's a key meeting of the G8 or something like that. That consultation, would that consultation be on the pre-election channel basis, or would it be specifically informed by the figures that the election had thrown up?
No, it tends to be specifically from the incumbent minister. The classic case we have of 2010 was, as I said, Alistair Darling going to an ECOFIN meeting to talk about bailout of Greece. And so it's the specific minister, in that case the Chancellor.
Who does the specific minister consult with?
Numbers. In his case, he consulted with Vince Cable and George Osborne, so it was his opposite numbers. The difficulty we have is what one understands by the term to consult. Now, for some, consulting is just telling them. For others, consulting is obviously and seeking their views. And for others, it's and making sure that you listen to and adhere to what they've asked you to do. We have the account from Alistair Darling. George Osborne's spoken about it a few times since as well. In his memoirs, Darling says that he rang them both up and consulted with them and explained his positioning on it, and particularly the issue was whether or not the UK would vote in favour of the bailout and the size of the bailout. And he says that both agreed with him that there could only be one Chancellor, and so therefore ultimately the decision was his. There were differences of views, certainly I think more with George Osborne about a particular part of the deal and whether or not it should be voted for. But in the end, the reason why it's not so much of an issue was that the vote was in the end under qualified majority voting, and so the UK would not have had a veto. So Darling voting in favour of it would not, if he had voted against it, wouldn't have prevented the move. If it had been under different circumstances, if the UK had have had a veto, it goes back to the point that Robert made earlier about whether or not you're in a position where an incumbent government has effectively forced the hand or made a decision on the part of a future government. So it's a scenario we've not had and not tested. We've seen it in other countries. New Zealand had a classic case where an incumbent government, against very vocal protest from not only his civil service but also the opposition members, refused to devalue at a time of currency crisis, but was ultimately made to understand that this was a breach of the convention, a very serious one, and they subsequently changed some of the wording in the conventions around that in order to deal with that. So it's a precedent we haven't experienced yet, but we can look to others to experience.
If there was a longer period, And if we are talking about some big decisions, and if there is confusion, particularly if there are significant new numbers, almost new parties perhaps, to be consulted with in parliamentary terms, would that consultation, with the fact of that consultation on these conventions, would that discharge any requirement for parliamentary scrutiny, either in real time or close to real time, or subsequently?
I think, no, sorry, I was going to say, I think in those circumstances, if Parliament's not there, it's difficult for them to be doing, there's no formal scrutiny that they can do. I would find it very strange to think that if something like that happened, Parliament wouldn't find a very good reason for doing a subsequent study, inquiry, scrutiny of whatever kind it can on it. So, yeah, exactly.
As most parliamentary scrutiny is.
Unfortunately. So, sorry, Mark, the answer then is to amend the proclamation on March the 30th to ensure that Parliament returns immediately after the general election rather than at a time when the executive chooses.
Well, Chairman, I would only say talk to some of the parliamentary clerks and they will explain to you why there's a lot of business that has to be done when a new Parliament first meets, and they strongly supported in 2010 that the Parliament, let me get my dates right, that the Queen's speech should not be until 12 days after, whereas before then it had been quicker.
Yeah, I think Parliament first meets to elect the Speaker. It's the Wednesday after the Thursday election, and then there's usually about 3 days of swearing in of new members, which is itself quite a tight schedule. And then, so one's looking at then the following week, so it's almost 2 weeks afterwards, inevitably, when the Queen's
I was thinking more of Parliament meeting the day after a general election, so there can be an open discussion without a vote, and the Parliament then adjourns until such time as it needs to do what, frankly, trivial bureaucratic things like swearing members in.
I think
surely we're not going to select the government on the basis that it's for the convenience of the parliamentary clerks.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, your understanding may be better, but I think there is a requirement that members are sworn in before they're able to vote on such matters.
Well, I'm sure. Since we're doing this by convention, we could have a system whereby everyone stands and raises their hand if they so wish at one time, rather than take 3 days. Surely not 3 days. If the country is in some sort of crisis, the argument that we're going to take 3 days to swear the members in cannot possibly hold sway.
I don't know enough about the process. I think it's something, as Robert said, you'll have to take up with the clerks, and it will be a matter for your committee to recommend.
Chairman, I struggle, I'm afraid, to get my head around the idea that Parliament might meet the day after the election, when you've all been out campaigning for 4 to 5 weeks.
Are we too tired to make a decision?
You've been out the whole night.
Someone needs to help us out.
You're completely exhausted. I suspect you might find yourself on your own.
That's a threat the country may quake at the thought of. But let's be serious. Not the day after. Have a little bit of a rest. And the day after, we're talking about the country having not made a clear decision, and the country needs to be governed, and the role of newly elected members of Parliament. It's as if we are a fleeting electoral college, and we can't wait to get rid of Parliament and hand power back to the executive. And we seem to be not thinking of a different way to do this.
Well, Chairman, there is a negotiation that takes place between political parties. It seems to me, lying behind your complaint is possibly a lack of democratic processes within political parties. That's a matter that only the political parties can resolve. And the negotiations, I think, have to take place largely in secret, because deals are being done, compromises are being struck. Again, if you want to be a member of Labour's negotiating team, I'm sure there are channels within the Labour Party for you to apply. But I'm sorry, I can't seriously believe that the negotiations can take place on the floor of the House of Commons?
No, I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is proper involvement of those that the British people have just elected, and that proper involvement can be consultation and regular discussions on a day-by-day basis as negotiations unfold. But I think, Robert, you are hitting the nail on the head. This is not a matter for parliamentary procedure so much as the will of the leaders of the political party to share power with those who have just been newly elected. But Mark, please continue.
Because of the nature of the British Constitution, you seem to be accepting that there can't be a standard confirmation vote whereby Parliament, in essence, votes in or ratifies the Prime Minister, as happens in many other places. Do you accept, therefore, that the confirmation vote on a government should therefore remain the Queen's speech, or would there be some other proxy confirmation vote that might be used? For instance, whether or not the House of Commons actually elects a leader of the House of Commons, and it would be the person who would be nominated by the person who's prospectively the Prime Minister, that it's their nomination as leader of the House of Commons, that would be the test vote on the formation of a government, and then the Queen's speech can take its course subsequently.
Yes. Forgive me, I think we've already gone over this ground, and I'm not saying that it's not possible in the British Constitution to have what you're calling a confirmation vote, whereby the new House of Commons, in effect, elects or nominates the Prime Minister. I've said that we are exploring the feasibility of doing that. We're not yet advocating it because we are not yet completely confident how feasible it would be. But it would be a much more transparent process for the voting public, because they would then understand that a general election is a parliamentary election in which the people elect a parliament, and then in the second stage of the process, Parliament decides who shall form the government. Mm-hmm. And the most transparent and obvious way in which that could be done, that second stage, is if Parliament itself elects, nominates, through a series of votes, who is going to be the Prime Minister, and the Queen then appoints that person as Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. So that is the principled argument, if you like, for trying to find a way towards having a nomination procedure as the first major item of business in a new Parliament.
Mm-hmm. So the Parliament would take the decision first, rather than the sovereign appears to take that decision on whoever's advice, whoever happens to arrive at the palace. And if people decided that constitutional history and other sensitivities meant that Parliament couldn't be seen to appoint the Prime Minister rather than the sovereign, would there be other proxy confirmation votes that we could look for?
Well, forgive me, I think again we've gone over this ground, because in terms of earlier votes, there is the debate on the Queen's speech, and I've mentioned the possibility of having a vote immediately after the Queen's speech. I suppose there could be a motion simply that this House has confidence in Her Majesty's government of a formal kind, even without a Queen's speech.
Yeah.
There can surely be an advisory motion from the House to Her Majesty, which is the way to couch it, that the House recommends to Her Majesty the acceptance of Mr. Cameron or Mr. Miliband or whatever,
I mean,
as the
effect,
Prime Minister.
In effect, that is the wording that goes from the Scottish Parliament.
Well, it's just it is one thing for there to be a clear majority in the context of there being a coalition and people are therefore committed and locked in on that basis, so people know then that's the intended government that people have committed to between them provide a working majority. It would be a different situation in the event of confidence and supply. There would probably be a clear agreement, a programme for government, a coalition agreement in the first position. It may be less clear in the second. There may not be one single document. Some of the parties who are named as being likely to provide confidence and supply might provide very different language around their terms of providing confidence and supply than the government or the would-be government are intending, and that can create a lot of uncertainty both politically and in terms of the markets. Therefore, in that situation, do you think there is an added reason for there to be some clearer confirmatory vote that indicates the likely intended support pattern in that Parliament, such again as has happened in I know in the Irish context that it's generally happened around the vote on the Taoiseach, whereby independents have then either conveniently abstained or sided in the formation, and that has indicated that they are in a working deal around a government, and it provides a degree of confidence. That might be less available here.
Well, we're now getting into the detail of the procedure if there were a nomination process as the first major item of business. And one concern is that if motions were moved, for example, that this House nominate Mr. David Cameron as Prime Minister, that such a motion might be amendable, and that a minor party might then seek to attach conditions by moving an amendment, etc. And that's why I pointed towards the procedure in Scotland, because there it's very straightforward. There is no possibility of motions or amendments. They have a straightforward nomination process, and then they have a series of votes on the nominees.
Which was the intention in the Good Friday Agreement as well.
Now, Robert, I know you need to go, so I'm going to ask Fabian if you've got anything particularly pertinent for Robert.
Chairman, I can stay for another 5 or 10 minutes.
Oh, excellent. No, in that case, Fabian, you can go on as planned.
I'll try and be as brief as possible, Robert and Catherine. In both Scotland and Wales, the civil service have provided greater levels of support in negotiations for the formation of a government than has been provided at Westminster. I think that's pretty clear. Now, I wondered if you would advocate greater involvement of the civil service in negotiations on forming a United Kingdom government than is currently the position present. And do you think that the civil service should be involved in providing more than simply factual information to any negotiations?
The first point to make is that it's up to the parties to decide how much support to accept from or to ask from the civil service. And we know that in 2010, the civil service, for example, offered to provide note takers for the negotiations, and the parties rejected that offer. So it's up to the parties to decide whether they want civil service help or not. In terms of whether the civil service should be able to offer factual information and possibly advice, I said in my written submission that I thought that they should be able to offer both. Again, it's up to the parties to decide whether to take up that offer. Why do I want the civil service to be so closely involved? Because I think it's in the public interest that the negotiators be as fully informed as possible about the different issues which they're negotiating on. And again, let's get real. Each negotiating team, let's suppose this is a negotiation between two parties, is likely only to be 4 or 5 aside. And those people are not going to be supermen and women who know every area of policy in their own manifesto, let alone the other parties, and they're not going to be master of every subject area. So issues will arise where the negotiators want to ask, what will this cost? how long will this take? Will we run into legal difficulties? Now, those sound like factual questions, and they can be put in that way, but as I said in my submission, to get sensible answers, the answers will come, I hope, couched with a bit of advice.
Yeah, it's also worth revisiting some of the issues that surround the guidance that we currently have for how this was set up last time round. The Cabinet Office published the guidance that they'd sent round to civil servants in the expectation that this might occur. Obviously, it didn't then, or at least it wasn't used as fully as it might have been able to. I mean, firstly, it's one thing that we didn't have trouble with last time round is that both of the parties involved in the primary negotiations, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, not the Liberal Labour ones, did turn down this idea of having civil servants in the room. They did take up the offer of logistics support, and I think they also took some help on terms of factual information, but not extensively so. I mean, I wonder what situation you would get to where one party did want the support of a civil service and the other party did not. Or if you have an incumbent government that wants the support of its civil service, is that automatically through this process, or is it through the normal dealings which ministers might have with civil servants? Is there a restriction there? So there's still a lot of questions to answer around that. The other ones are there in the guidance. It sets out that what should happen in the event that one party asks for a piece of factual information on, policy X. If another party doesn't ask for that same piece of information, it doesn't get it, nor does it even know that the first party has actually asked for it. Now, if both do ask for it, they get the same piece of advice, supposedly. So there's clearly an expectation there that they would have quite strict convention and guidance around what constitutes advice.
So let me just, sorry to interrupt you, but so therefore, should that information be provided as a matter of course to all parties,
so this is the
irrespective
question.
Of whether they ask for it or not?
Yes, this is the question.
Okay. What would your answer be?
In Scotland, in the run-up to the election, not in this particular process that we're talking about, because they had two coalition parties in government together in the run-up to an election, they were very clear to make sure that both parties got the same kind of information, but in what was called separate space. So they both had the freedom and the opportunity to be able to develop their ideas with civil service support. Now, that was separate from how you would use the civil service in a negotiation period, but it does beg a very interesting question about what would constitute the right kind of even-handedness. I mean, the guidance says all parties must be treated equally. It doesn't imply that the incumbent should be treated in any different way from the parties of opposition who may also be in negotiation. But it then goes on to state that very unequivocally that there will be this difference of factual information if one asks for it and another does not.
Okay. Anything to add, Robert? I know you've got to go. So.
Sorry, I have nothing to add.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Paul, I realise we didn't include you because you were the last one here, but are you okay? Nothing additional?
Think a lot, as you know.
Absolutely. Very rarely speak.
I find it very educational. Right.
Robert, that's a good moment. Catherine, thank you so much. Thank you very much. I think this is something that is going to be, unusually for us, a matter of quite topical interest very shortly. And the concept of allowing the public, or even members of Parliament, into this secret society that we've created around the transition, I think is a really healthy one for our democracy, and you've added greatly to our understanding of that this afternoon. Thank you so much.
And your committee has a very important role, so thank you for the inquiry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, colleagues, for attending.